this is a very, very special person to have as a speaker in our open lecture series, because Bala and I go back a long way to the 70s, 77 onwards in Cambridge. And I find that among economists, development economists, I mean, he's well known and well established. But there are features to Bala's work that are quite special and extraordinary. Apart from being a teacher of economics, and he's also worked in the World Bank, on Ukraine, he's worked in the ILO, and the organization I was with for 22 years, the United Nations Development Program. All that apart, it's simply that there's a certain quality of freshness in everything that Bala writes. I mean, I recall a fantastic review that he did of the Dres and Sen volume on what is it called, An Uncertain Glory. It's a absolutely amazing review because it not simply says, oh, it's Sen and Dres and therefore how wonderful. It's a very critical review, actually. It's very critical on some. This is a long time ago, but I recall on the empirical part of the book, the kinds of casual assumptions or statements that are made, which he points out are not on, and I think he had a reference to Keynes. I mean, the well-known statement of Keynes is that in the long run we are all dead. But the other statement that Keynes made is that we only live in transitions. So I remember Bala picked that out. So, and therefore I said, it's okay, you would have expected him to come and talk on a topic related to development economics or even public policy. But because I know that his range and depth is such that I wanted him to speak on a subject other than, straightforward economics, and so he proposed a couple of topics, and we picked nationalism, secularism, and freedom as it's very timely. And so I'm particularly happy to have Bala with us. He does one semester at Ashoka, and so every time he does a semester at Ashoka, I think from now on we'll request you to come in for one lecture to our students and our faculty. So Bala, over to you.
I'm just slideshow शुरू करना है. Okay, it comes. Okay, great. Oh, perfect, terrific. This is exactly what I wanted. Sudarshan, I'm just worried that if I sit here, I'll block the screen. Should I move here? Which is no problem at all for me.
People can see the screen.
Can you see the screen fully? I'm not covering anything. Okay, excellent. I'm not particularly tall in any case. So. All right. Thank you so much, Sudarshan, for this extraordinarily generous introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I had prepared to say it is a great pleasure to be at the other place, but after you walked me around the campus, I changed my phrase. I mean, we are nowhere. I mean, Ashoka is nowhere in terms of at least size compared to Jindal. I mean, I didn't know you were so large and so diverse, of course. So it's a really very special privilege to be here and to give this talk. Thank you very much indeed. I find that I have quite a few slides, so if you don't mind, I'll be very brisk in the presentation, precisely so that we'll have time for discussion, right? Now, so I might speak for the entire hour, Sudarshan. Huh? I'll try to do it quicker. Is that okay? We have till 5:30, right? So we'll still have. All right. So, okay. Thank you. Now, I just want to say that I'm also aware that democracy and such issues are probably not areas where economists have comparative advantage, but I think it's a matter of such importance to us, and of course to us Indians and the world also, given the size of India, and also out of some conviction that maybe perhaps economists have something to contribute. I decided to speak on this topic, and Sudarshan very kindly agreed. So that's the background to why I've chosen, but I've also been thinking about this a little bit. All right, so the abstract has been sent out, so I won't bother to read it. You've all seen it, yeah? It's very straightforward. I speak about the current discourse, basically. That's what I'm concerned with. I'm focusing on where secularism and nationalism, not necessarily in that order, but are given great prominence. But I'd like to also say that there's another aspect to democracy, which is freedom. And I'd like to suggest that maybe the discourse should be broadened to incorporate that, and also perhaps the discussion of nationalism and secularism, principally in the media today, which of course is very dominant, possibly more important than us academics, one has to accept perhaps. In the media, the discussion, the focus on nationalism and secularism tends to crowd out discussions of freedom, which I think are central to democracy. Right, just as a reminder that long before us social scientists and academics began to talk about democracy, many others had already been reflecting upon this. So a couple of comments, a couple of quotes that I'd like to just show you. One, of course, is from quite a probable individual, Radhakrishnan. This was, I think, just before the first Republic Day, 1950. And the other is a piece by the hero of Arvind Adiga's book, The White Tiger. All right, okay. Right, and since that, then the Adiga's book was written. Abhinav Bindra, Haryana boy, presumably, at least he lives in Chandigarh, has made us all proud. But I guess the other two aspects remain salient to India. Okay. So when asked by Andre Malraux as to what he considered his challenges as Prime Minister of India, Nehru had replied to build a secular state in a religious society and a just society by just means, right? So you're all familiar with it. Unfortunately, it's probably not as widely remembered as I believe it ought to be. I contend that the first remains the main challenge faced by Indian democracy today. Both, sorry. Actually, I'm so sorry, the order in which it's come should have been reversed. It should have been, I think Nehru had said, just society by just means and a secular state in a religious society, right? But so that's what I meant when I said contend that the first remains the main challenge faced by Indian democracy today to just build a just society. It also strikes me as significant, especially in the light of the practices of political parties today, Nehru did not mention nationalism. Can anybody credibly suggest that Nehru was not nationalist? Nehru was second only to Gandhi as the leader of a national movement that is unlikely to be matched in human history for the sheer number of people who had been set free by it. As part of the movement, he had spent over 9 years in the jails of an imperial power that saw itself as different to the natives of India. I shall return later in my talk to answer the question I have posed, i.e. why Nehru had made no references to nationalism, but I clarify right away why I have quoted Nehru here. I do not suggest that Nehru's actions as Prime Minister were consistent with his dictum as expressed in that statement, but I do assert that he had identified the true challenges that Indian democracy faced then and faces today. In addition, I assert that India's leading political parties appear not only to not share his convictions as expressed, but also often act in ways contrary to them, including some possibly Nehruvians. Democracy in India has received worldwide attention, especially from observers based in Western democracies. I might point out that the admiration has turned vocal ever since India's economy has billowed out. Recent example reviews of India's democracy have been congratulatory. Some recent examples are the books The Great Indian Rope Trick by Roderick Matthews, How India Became Democratic by Ornit Shani, and The Raisina Model by Meghnad Desai, whom, of course, all of you recognize as a commentator on Indian affairs. These observers have generally marveled at one or the other of the two features of Indian democracy. Some that a country of such diversity has held together. Others have remarked upon not only the successful conduct of elections, but also the peaceful transition once they are completed, both seen as remarkable in a poor country which till recently had very low levels of democracy, i.e. the acceptance of the verdict of elections. Descriptions of democracy in India have also come from residents in India. One such published earlier this year goes as follows. An interesting feature of Southern Asia for decades has been the existence of a liberal democracy in India, in a region inhabited largely by non-plural or mixed regimes, i.e. obviously referring to the rest of South Asia. Commitment to political and civil liberties, human rights, social and economic freedoms, and a secular ethos are the hallmarks of India's constitution. All right. It is natural that as Indians we should feel elated by this praise, but it should also leave us circumspect. Is democracy about procedural routines such as elections and guidebooks such as written constitutions? Or is it about the transformations wrought due to our adopting it, i.e. democracy, as the form of our government? The focus of my talk will be almost exclusively on the second aspect. However, I shall in passing address the issue of the longevity of the Indian Union. It is indeed noteworthy that in an international comparison, a country of such diversity as India has held together for so long. Not only in 1947, but well into the 60s, there had been skepticism about India's prospects as a single unit or a single entity. The leading skeptic in the 1940s was the imperialist Winston Churchill. Subsequently, Western observers who were by no means as unsympathetic to India, such as the American Selig Harrison, observing developments in India in the 1960s, had wondered if a splintering was not inevitable. Both the a priori skepticism and the subsequent wonderment at the survival of the Indian unit and the explanation that this is due to democracy may be related to the viewing of the world through the lens of Europe's history. For much of the 19th century and well into the 20th, Europe had been driven by nationalism. It had independent countries that were smaller than many of India's states, and these were often at war with one another. And the humiliation of the minorities, cultural, linguistic, and religious in these states had been routine, especially at the time of war, almost as if it is de rigueur to nationalism. It is true that by comparison, India does provide, at least till recently, a more optimistic picture of cohabitation. The Europeans naturally wonder how it is that India's diverse people, harboring communities as distinct as the Slavs are from the Iberians, live quite so comfortably under the same flag. The wonderment, however, overlooks that a political entity containing much of India today had existed even before many of the countries of today's Europe were formed. And the people of India have repeatedly interacted with one another for at least 2 millennia, i.e. even before we had formal democracy or any kind of democracy. The latter could not but have fostered the idea of a certain cultural unity despite differences of language, creed, and ethnicity. The idea of a cultural commonality among Indians can be asserted, I want to emphasize this, without any reference to religious unity. One need only to recognize the thinking underlying Ashoka's rock edicts at Girnar in Gujarat, Kandahar in today's Afghanistan, Sanchi in UP, Dholi in Orissa, and Yerragudi, Andhra Pradesh, to recognize that a certain idea of India had existed even before the common era. Ashoka's edicts convey an idea of India that is largely devoid of religion as faith. His motives were to propagate a certain idea of righteous conduct. The expression that appears repeatedly in the edicts, in the Ashoka edicts, is dharma or dhamma, which in its original sense had to do with conduct and little to do with faith as commitment to a divine order. Thus, we're able to see at the very outset that an Indian unity need not be posited in religious, linguistic, or racial terms at all. It may as well be posited in terms of of shared values. The point that I want to make is the argument of race has been used from both ends, from the point of view of a unity in India and also its inevitable inner lack of coherence. So, but I don't think it is necessary, is what I'm trying to say in this, but to use it in that sense, or it's a non sequitur to use it in that sense, is what I'm trying to argue here. While considering the history of India in the time of Ashoka, we come across a value of particular relevance to us today. Allowing for individual beliefs, Ashoka cautions his subjects through his edicts, he was emperor after all, so it has to be an edict, not to emphasize their own dharma over the dharma of others. So we have reason to believe that pluralism of religion, as we see it today, was recognized as a value in ancient India, implying that we may constitute a community without reference to religion. The recognition of pluralism as an underlying value and glue that can hold India together has often been ignored both by political parties and citizens, which has inevitably impacted democracy as it has played out in independent India. This brief detour to the times of Ashoka was intended to make the point that a certain idea of India had existed even before democracy was established here. This brings me to the first of the themes that I wish to discuss today, namely nationalism. India had witnessed a national movement that had culminated the end of colonial rule over the subcontinent in 1947. I repeat, for the sheer number of people involved in it, it has not been matched in human history, and perhaps is unlikely to be matched in the future. In India, at least after 1947, the nationalism that had motivated the anti-colonial movement had died a natural death. However, a subtler form of nationalism, which had to do with India's role in the post-war world, took its place. This was state-sponsored, however, and appears not to have been shared by the large majority of Indians, whose outlook was to a large extent shaped by their material conditions, which did not transform in a hurry. I'll come back to this if anybody's interested. I'm sorry I can't spend more time on this issue here. As a post-colonial, but I do explicate that a little bit here. As a post-colonial nation, India was to adopt the role of a moral force in international affairs. India worked tirelessly towards decolonization and the ending of apartheid, remaining non-aligned for the two main power blocks of the day. India had a presence in world affairs that was vastly out of line with its economic prowess. I'm talking the 1950s. This, however, ended with Nehru, possibly also with the loss of prestige suffered in the border war of 1962. For the past 3 decades, we've witnessed in India the rise of a nationalism that is no longer based on universally accessible ideas. It is both cultural and exclusive. Even when it does not identify itself as such, it is clear to the observer that this idea of India is based on a Hindu religious identity. It speaks of a glorious past that predates not just colonialism, but also Muslim invasion, in quotes. This is supposed to have been a period of great ingenuity, counting upon its inventions, airplanes and plastic surgery. The vision is not only religious, but has little space for the diversities of history, language, or culture. Those who do not subscribe to this view of India's past and reject its potential for forging a national identity today are seen as anti-national. The vehicle for this brand of nationalism is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is currently in power at the center and has been expanding its reach over the past 4 years, as seen through the outcomes of elections to the state legislatures. This may be overturned in the next month, but I'm talking the past 4 years. In May 2014, this nationalism, long germinating, came finally to be empowered. Since then, Muslims and Dalits have faced physical assault over a swathe of the country that extends from Gujarat to Jharkhand. A unifying factor in these assaults has been cow protection. Both attacks on Muslims and Dalits based on allegations of violating the sanctity of the cow and the responses to these actions by elected governments point to a certain transformation of India's democracy. Democracy in India has also emerged as a medium with which to assert one's identity, which includes the humiliation of the other, either from the perspective of righting some historical wrong or on the basis of perceived racial prerogative, as the case may be. This assertion has at times been spontaneous, but democratically elected governments at the center and the states may have abetted it. Instances of the latter, i.e. states abetting this nationalism, are the legislation of the cattle trade, subsequently retracted by the Narendra Modi government at the center, and the actions immediately after the election of the Yogi Adityanath government in UP. These responses imply that elected governments in parts of India now abet Hindu nationalism. But there has been present in India, even before the rise of the BJP, a strand of nationalism that the literature Alok Rai has termed Hindi nationalism. This, as the term implies, is the aggressive assertion of Hindi as not just the preeminent language of India, but the national one. The actualization of which idea requires its imposition across the country, a kind of manifest destiny, if you please, in the Indian context. Critics of Hindu nationalism somewhat lazily confine Hindi nationalism to the former, but it distorts reality and stands in the way of deepening democracy in India. I just want to say, for those who are not familiar with the work of Alok Rai, he works on, his best-known work was on his grandson of Munshi Premchand, but his best-known work is on Orwell. Yeah? So anyway, I'm just trying to say he's also certainly knowledgeable about Hindi literature. All right. While Hindi nationalism comes quite easily to the Hindu nationalists, it predates a challenge to secularism as a guiding principle for India and the brazen assault against Muslims and Dalits which we observe today. The question of which language should be adopted as a national one had preoccupied some sections of Congress even before independence. There was a strong force within the Congress itself, and this role should be exclusively that of Hindi. It is not clear today what the views towards India's minorities were as harbored by this group within the Congress party, but it is clear that the party did not appear uncomfortable with the idea that its stated inclusiveness with respect to Muslims and Dalits, though not the term current at that time, the term Dalit, could coexist with its views on language, which took the form of an unambiguously majoritarian prescription of a national language for a linguistically diverse polity. Gandhi himself typified this position, interestingly. No one can allege the slightest animosity towards Muslims, but it is the case that Gandhi himself was quite clear that post-independence India should exclusively use Hindi for communication, and that Southern objection to this proposal was not legitimate. His views on language are clearly stated in the constructive program, which otherwise is a very impressive document and of some relevance to us today. I would like to take a minute to explain to my young audience, I hope that's not patronizing, I think most of the people here are younger than I, of the significance for Gandhi of the constructive program, and therefore its significance for us. Gandhi felt strongly that the struggle for independence was more than just a war, though by non-violent means, against a colonial power, but was aimed at building a new society altogether. His constructive program outlines the shape of this society, i.e. of India, and how this ought to be achieved. It is eminently worth reading even today. Gandhi's views on language may have been influenced by the context of the anti-colonial movement, when every potential fissure was to be ironed over. However, it is not at all clear that the similar latitude may be granted the Congress party in post-independence India. The interesting question is how a political party, so conscious of the existence of a religious minority in India, namely the Muslims, and correctly so, could blithely ignore the fact that there can also be linguistic minorities. At independence, the claims of Hindi were not overwhelming, even in terms of numbers. The linguist G.N. Devi, has estimated that Hindi written in Devanagari was the language of use by about a third of the then population in 1947. Not that numbers necessarily should be the basis of the choice of a language or of a national language. In a telling remark on choosing a national language on the basis of the number of speakers, the Tamil nationalist Annadure was to point out the absurdity of choosing the crow of the peacock as India's national bird based on a numerical count. I must acknowledge Ram Guha for this. I hadn't known of it myself. It's as spoken by Anadure in Parliament. The privileging of Hindi was obtained by voting in the Constituent Assembly, where it was won by one vote. There is an issue of fairness in the use of the majority rule to resolve significant differences among members of a polity. While voting may well be appropriate when it comes to deciding whether the country should allow private players to supply air travel services, it is not obvious that it is the right means to determine the means of communication to be used in governance. Imposing Hindi as a sole language of governance in India over the objection of the speakers of other Indian languages should be called out as majoritarianism. In 1965, matters came to a head when the 15 years mandated for the use of English alongside Hindi in governance came to an end. There was spontaneous protest in Tamil Nadu and to an extent in Karnataka. Though a relatively junior minister at that point, Indira Gandhi, flew to Madras at a time of rioting, and it was agreed that English would be retained in communication between the centre and the states till such time as the southern states desired it. This was an instance of a very mature resolution of difference through democracy in India. Some observers say that sections of the Congress, licking their wounds after having lost the battle to impose Hindi on the rest of India overtly by the constitutional process, have been busy trying to do so covertly, exploiting the existence of a central public sector to do so. Nevertheless, by and large, tension over national language has remained dormant over the past half century. However, it has arisen again after the coming to power of the Narendra Modi government. Various instances of both the promotion of Hindi and its imposition on unwilling states have been identified. Perhaps the most recent of these is the Modi government chose, without nationwide consultation or even prior notice, to insert Hindi numerals on the replacement to the currency notes demonetized by it in November 2016. It would be difficult to describe this in any other terms than Hindi chauvinism. The numerals that had adorned the rupee notes till then are recognized the world over as Indian, if you wish, actually as Hindi in the Arab world. That's the expression for India, after all, isn't it? Even though they are named for the Arabic traders who introduced them to the West. So to guard against the possibility that it is merely my perceived Dravidian ancestry that leads me to query the move by the government of India, I decided to run it past my student, a native of Sonipat, Haryana. And he was of the belief that Hindi numerals were hardly used even in the bazaars of his village. It is unfortunate that one of the markers in the legal tender of the Indian Republic, one with an extraordinary civilizational past, had to be changed to suit the cultural agenda of the RSS. I end this section of my talk with 2 points. First, opponents of Hindi nationalism, of Hindu nationalism that is being fanned today, rightly identified as a politics of hate aimed at India's Muslims, but stop short of recognizing Hindi nationalism as a form of cultural erasure aimed at the equally valid cultures of the rest of the country. In the animal kingdom, this is the favored posture of the ostrich. The second point is that it is most disappointing that, having staved off the imposition of Hindi on grounds that is exclusionary, India's southern states have not been successful in nurturing a culture of inclusion when it comes to language. Tamil Nadu, in particular, had been a rich trove of cultural treasure, with Madras having been a city where the Telugu, Kannada, and the Malayalam-speaking peoples had flourished without having to submerge their identity well into the 1960s. After having won the battle against exclusive use of Hindi in governance on behalf of the southern peoples, the DMK was to champion the exclusive use of Tamil in its own territories. In the process, it extinguished what had been an exemplary site of cultural diversity. In an attempt to paraphrase Nehru's replacing the imperialism of English with the imperialism of Hindi, we might consider replacing the chauvinism of Hindi nationals with the chauvinism of the Dravidian. Is it absolutely essential for a country to pick a single language as a national one? we have the example of Switzerland, which has 4 national languages. This has not led to the country being invaded, nor has it stood in the way of its attaining prosperity. It is extremely simplistic to see a nation as constituted by homogeneous cultural groups who are the speakers of the same language. After all, we have the conception by Benedict Anderson of the nation as an imagined community. Needless to say, to clarify this, you can be a community which is bound by shared values which have nothing to do with culture. By virtue of its history of diversity, and not only of language, but also of faith, and the values adopted by its leadership in 1947, a significant number of Indians have for sufficiently long imagined themselves to be part of a community. Attempt to thrust one's faith, culture, or language in the people of this country is to belittle this grand imagination which is in our power to redeem fully even today. I conclude this section by referring to how Ashoka Maurya had dealt with the fact that he ruled over a diverse people. As you know, Ashoka had attempted to communicate his ideas on dharma or right conduct to all corners of a far-flung empire. These edicts, carved on stone, on rock surfaces, or especially constructed pillars, are fascinating for what they speak of, but I focus here only on the attitude to language. Ashoka's edicts have been found on more than 30 sites across India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Most of them are written in the Brahmi script, from which most Indian scripts and many of those used in Southeast Asia are believed to have descended. The language used in the edicts found in the eastern part of the subcontinent is a type of Magadhi, very likely the language of Ashoka's court. The language used in the edicts found in the western part of India is closer to Sanskrit. And a bilingual edict in Afghanistan is written in both Aramaic and Greek. Ashoka clearly was aware of the bigger prize and had not allowed himself to be held back by some narrow linguistic nationalism. I now turn to the second of the concepts that is at the center of the discourse on democracy in India, namely secularism. Secularism in the democracies of America and continental Europe explicitly means the separation of the state and the church. Historically, the European state was guarded in its relationship with the church when it was not actually hostile to it. In independent India, the political leadership adopted the stance that the state would not only view all religions as equal, but accord them equal respect. This came to be projected as a distinctly Indian secularism. An aspect of the latter is that the state in India has remained more benign towards religion than in other democracies. In a way, this so-called Indian secularism seems to be a throwback to the Hindu ideal of Sarva Dharma Samabhava. This may appear a politically correct state policy, but it becomes problematic when it is expected of citizens, as tends to happen in India, that they subscribe to it. Not all religions allow for leeway. Consider, for instance, I am the way, the truth, and the life in the book of John, the Bible. More significantly, this so-called Indian secularism opened up the possibility of the state becoming respectful of the demands of often secular interests in the name of religion and remaining tolerant of unequal arrangements in the garb of religion. Should a Hindu woman be allowed to remarry of her own will, an idea traditionally abhorrent in Orthodox Hinduism? Can Khap panchayats interfere with marriage between consenting adults of different religions or castes? Should the practice of polygamy permissible under Islam be allowed in a secular democracy? How should the Indian state respond to resistance to gay rights emanating from Christian groups? And should an all-male priesthood be allowed to excommunicate a Parsi woman who marries outside the fold? That these are not hypothetical cases, but historical ones. Examples should be obvious. Historical examples, would be obvious to anyone who has observed India since 1947. We just have a case, a report in today's paper of a young woman in Rajasthan attempting suicide because she was forced to marry somebody she was betrothed to at age 3. almost all the cases listed reflect the inability under Indian secularism to call out the patriarchy that underlies much of religious thought and practice in India. Secularism as Sarva Dharma Sama Bhava often ends up upholding norms that are incompatible with democracy. The secular state in India is also compromised by inherited colonial practices. I mentioned three. The first is that of classifying citizens according to their religion and some routine interactions with the state that are of a civil nature. The second is the existence of religion-based civil codes. Secondly, citizens are liable to criminal prosecution if it is alleged that they have, by their action, insulted the sensibilities of particular religious communities. These are instances of the sphere of religion, privileging of religion over individual conscience in the civil sphere. In 1947, the appeal of secularism after 1947, the appeal of secularism may have been undermined by the practices of India's political parties. What would be some instances of the violation of the principle of secularism by the Indian state? It commenced with the codification of Hindu personal law by Nehru. Nehru's lapse was not to have led a move clearly intended to secure the rights of women, but to have restricted codification to laws governing Hindu practices as opposed to practices of all religions. With hindsight, we can see that his actions were incomplete at that time. Mary Roy's appeal to the Supreme Court seeking equal rights to her ancestral property of a Syrian Christian woman, and the more recent petition by the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan seeking to invalidate triple talaq attest to that. However, while there had been opposition to the move from even within the Congress party at that time, i.e. in the 1950s, there was no widespread disaffection in the country, for Nehru was perceived as acting in good faith, so to speak. This was not the case when the other serious violation of the secular principle, which was when Rajiv Gandhi piloted the Muslim Women's Act in 1986. Recall that this was in response to the Supreme Court's ruling of the right to alimony upon divorce of the 75-year-old Shah Banu. This was viewed with some dismay, i.e. Rajiv Gandhi's actions, and seen to be an act of appeasement of sections claiming leadership of the Muslims of India. Interestingly, it is not seen as an instance of Indian democracy having seriously led down a section of India's women. At least at the time of the enactment of the Hindu Code Bill, Nehru had been remorseful, saying, "I was not able to do as much for my Muslim sisters." No such moral dilemma appears to have racked the Congress party in 1986, its ideologues continuing to hail the Muslim Women's Bill as the defense of secularism well into the 21st century. The sole exception within the Indian National Congress had been Arif Muhammad Khan, who resigned from the party on grounds of conscience. But the dropping of the fig leaf was yet to come, though. As if to mollify the ensuing disaffection, Rajiv Gandhi allowed Shilanyas on the disputed site, till then occupied by the Babri Masjid. Appeasement reached its apotheosis when he launched his campaign for re-election from Ayodhya, unmistakably promising Ramaraja if he were return to power. It proved to be the thin edge of the wedge and may have well emboldened Hindu chauvinists to lead a mob that demolished the mosque in 1992, not to mention its contribution to the rise of the BJP as a governing party. Though their actions may be in violations of the principle of secularism, the actions of Nehru and Rajiv Gandhi had not been instances of intending the diminution of a religious group. Though Rajiv Gandhi's actions in the Shah Banu case devalued the lives of Indian women. On the other hand, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Rules 2017, involving cattle but not other animals, comes across as aimed at the cultural, if not the religious practices of Muslims on grounds that it is considered unacceptable by a section of Hindus. In a democracy, a broader definition of secularism must extend to the cultural practices of religious communities that do not violate individual rights. And to that extent, this legislation may be seen as a violation of the spirit of secularism. Developments in India since 2014 are likely to have left our fellow citizens of the Muslim faith feeling insecure. The recent elections in Gujarat are unlikely to have given them much hope, with the then Vice President of the Congress Party and its chief campaigner using temple visits as photo ops when the representation of Muslims in its candidate list was very low indeed. Clearly, the expression "the temples of modern India" means something else to Nehru's descendants than what it did to the great man himself. Some have described the Congress leadership's discovery of the temples of Gujarat as smart secularism. Actually, it is an appeasement of Hindu chauvinism. Finally, among the more egregious violations of secularism in India is a recent attempt of the Punjab government to criminalize sacrilegious to the holy books of 4 major religions. This is as recent as August 2018. This when Section 295A of the colonial Penal Code already criminalizes acts that outrage religious feelings. Enactment of a blasphemy law should be considered anathema by a secular state. More importantly, it is also alien to Indian tradition. A large number of the schools of Indian philosophy were agnostic. To be precise, egalitarian reform movements in Indian history, ranging from Punjab to Kerala, may not have been possible in the presence of such a law, i.e., a blasphemy law. India's political parties have contributed to the deterioration of the trust between communities, and only a round rejection of their practices in this regard by the populace will discipline them. Citizenship in a democracy comes with the responsibility to discipline political parties. The future of secularism in India will depend on how effectively citizens do this. Interesting, I'd like to say, in Europe, the church has evolved, but not so in South Asia. An opposition to blasphemy laws has actually come from an unlikely source. There's a referendum on, an impending referendum in Ireland, interestingly enough, on whether the blasphemy law in Ireland's constitution should be removed. And there's a referendum which is pending. Ahead of a referendum on the subject, the Church and Society Commission of the Church of Ireland released the following statement. We recognize that there is grave concern at the way blasphemy laws have been used to justify violence and oppression against minorities in other parts of the world. We acknowledge that the current reference to blasphemy in the Constitution of Ireland is largely obsolete. Yeah, I just want to say the blasphemy, the bishops of Ireland have pointed out that it actually affects minorities of other faiths, but it's also something which is completely unequal vis-a-vis non-believers, i.e. people of no faith. Indian democracy needs a secular state as much as fish need water. It would be a grave mistake to reject it as something un-Indian, a Western import. In a society of religious citizens, a state must remain detached from religion as far as possible. Nehru, unlike today's politicians, was right to realize this as difficult but essential. Or maybe I should put it the other way around, as essential but difficult. I say this because many of those who speak in the name of secularism, etc. today, do not recognize also how difficult it is in some sense. But that is, of course, it is, of course, also essential. As an extension of the principle of secularism in a country in which Hindus predominate, the state would also be expected to protect the religious minorities from majoritarian forces within civil society. In northern India, this principle has been violated even by governments that swear allegiance to secularism. This is what I mean by how difficult it is. I refer to the events at Dadri and more so earlier at Muzaffarnagar in a UP ruled by the Samajwadi Party, which claims a high secularism as its creed. The discourse on secularism in India reminds us of Auden looking back on his political life in 1930s Europe. All the verse I wrote, all the positions I took did not save a single Jew. These writings, these attitudes only help oneself. They merely make people who think like one admire and like me, which is rather embarrassing. A poet tends to be reflexive. Political parties consciously avoid any reflexivity. They alter their course only when challenged by the demos in a democracy. In a democracy, secularism has implications of the conduct of both the state and the citizenry. The state must safeguard the legitimate interests of religious minorities. The state must step aside and not stand in the way when the courts, maybe I should say the executive, because courts are also part of the state, right? The executive must step aside and not stand in the way when courts advance individual rights over religious sanction, irrespective of whether that of the majority or the minority. citizens may seek a review of the court's decision, but must abide by the verdict of the court. Finally, the courts themselves would want to reflect carefully on the demarcation between areas where the writ of the Constitution is final and where it is not. This demarcation is not difficult to achieve on grounds of principle. Indian secularism may have encouraged the most sectarian behavior in the world's democracies, or certainly sectarian behavior, of which I wish to give some recent examples in chronological order. At a time of the last local elections in Kerala, a Muslim cleric publicly stated that women ought not to contest them. Hindu mobs hector women attempting to access, maybe I should say Hindu men, hector women attempting to access the Sabarimala temple after the SC ruling permitting it. Whatever may be the merits of the ruling, it is the law of the land at the moment. A bishop accused of rape by a nun is released on bail, a questionable decision that is not challenged by the government of Kerala, which had arrested him only reluctantly in the first place. A conglomerate of 14 churches in Mizoram expressed the view that Section 377 of the IPC ought not to have been read down by the Supreme Court. Perhaps in the spirit of full disclosure, I must mention that I was associated with a public campaign to repeal 377 in India. It is worth reflecting upon how this is possible, i.e. these incidents or these political stances that I've just referred to, in a republic that has secularism written into its constitution. Indian secularism may have left both the state and civil society in India unable to call out violation of human rights by those acting in the name of religion. Past actions by the Indian state may have created a strong, though perhaps not so large as yet, constituency in India that believes these, i.e. these actions, to constitute a departure from the principle of secularism. This constituency is set to grow, though it may not be very large now. So I'd like to conclude this section by saying the original European version of nationalism is not a model suited to the extreme diversity of India, i.e. one country, one flag, one language, one religion. However, the formation of the EU suggests that the Europeans themselves appear to have moved away from it, from the original conception of nationalism, and are willing to now embrace a wider view. But the understanding of secularism in the democracies of Europe and the United States, on the other hand, perhaps is more credible and holds out a brighter prospect for India than the muddled version that has been espoused by some of its avowedly secular political parties. All right, now I go on to speak about the last and in some ways the most significant part of my talk. Sudarshan, I may need a little more than an hour, but I will try and be as quick as possible. I'll move through this rapidly. Freedom, and this is the third part of my talk, which is what I wanted to emphasize. At its core, secularism is defined by an absence, the lack of religious predetermination of state policy. A political arrangement is inadequately defined by an absence. For virtue, it must rely on something that is both palpably present and unmistakably of value. This element, I contend, is found in freedom, in the presence of freedom. Or in the idea of freedom may have been more appropriate. We have reason to believe that to most humans, freedom is the preeminent state that they aspire to. Now, a form of government that draws its very name from the demos or the people cannot but be defined by the freedom a people enjoy under it. I argue that the idea of freedom gets far too little space in the current discourse on democracy in India, when actually it is the whole point of it. You may wonder why I say this when India today has almost all the institutions that we associate with democracy, such as a free press, perhaps not as free as we'd like to see it, free elections, thankfully relatively free because we do have an election commission which has so far, which has increasingly asserted some independence, and a constitution that guarantees an array of rights. Indeed, India's constitution is quite impressive for the rights it protects. And we also have courts that render these rights justiciable, though they take a long time. But we might ask whether these constitutional rights translate into substantive freedom in India. To address this question, we would need to establish the sense in which the term freedom is being used or to be used. The political philosopher Isaiah Berlin identified two conceptions of liberty, one negative and the other positive. Negative freedom, Berlin's chosen expression, is the absence of restraint on individual action. That is, you're not prevented from exercising your will either by the law or force exerted by other humans. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is the freedom to act as you desire. It is easy to see that negative freedom does not guarantee positive freedom. The fact that I am not unrestrained does not by itself ensure that I can be a doer, as Berlin had put it. Amartya Sen has used the idea of positive freedom to fashion a whole new view of development. For Sen, development is to be judged by the freedoms that individuals enjoy. For Sen, individuals are free when they are able to undertake the functionings they value. Now, development is the expansion of freedom in this sense. For Sen, what constrains individuals from undertaking the functions they value is the capabilities that they possess. From this emerges the idea of capability deprivation as a metric of poverty measurement, as distinct from either income or resources. So you could be income rich but capability poor. Sen has desisted from identifying the functionings that matter, or the necessary capabilities. The functionings that matter are, after all, to be chosen by the individuals themselves and not by some Olympian planner, however benign. On the other hand, as a purpose of democracy is to ensure that individuals are able to undertake the functions that they value, it must equip individuals with the necessary capabilities. For Sen, the list of capabilities is to be drawn up at the societal value, needless to mention at the societal level, needless to mention, by a democratic process. However, Sen has identified health and education as the most important elements contributing to an individual's capability. Equipping individuals with health and education then becomes a central task of public policy. Democracy and development. While strictly there is nothing that binds a democratic form of government to development as freedom, after all, Athenian democracy, which much of the West sees as its precious legacy, had no place for women, blacks, animals, or so-called passive homosexuals to be viewed with utter contempt. However, individuals contracting among themselves to form a democratic society are most likely to view it, i.e. freedom, as a mean, view it, i.e. the act of contracting to form a democratic society, are most likely to view it as a means to expansion of their freedom or freedoms. Alternatively, employing the roles and device of the veil of ignorance, we would expect that everyone contracting into a democracy would expect development in the sense of Sen. In this way, one can say democracy and positive freedom may be seen as intrinsically linked. Quite simply, democracy would be hollow without positive freedom, even when there is freedom from restraint. If it is capabilities that stand in the way of individuals not being able to attain the functionings that they value, the whole raison d'etre of democracy would be to strive to equalize them. It is easy to see that the equalization of capabilities is the surest way to prevent the accumulation of inequality of opportunity transmitted through inheritance, for instance. And once again, the public provision of health and education is the surest route to ensuring that the basic capabilities of individuals in a society will not diverge much. In order to appreciate the extent of democracy in India, therefore, we should be looking at development indicators in India. In particular, indicators which at least somewhere reflect the state of advance of capabilities in the country, individual capabilities. I shall do so now, viewing India's achievements in relation to those of the rest of the world. It may be noted that much of the rest of the world, including China, which in many ways is a natural comparator for India, does not have democracy as its form of government. So I want to start with just what is done normally, which is look at the level of living, and which is basically using a poverty line of $1.25 per day, which is done by the World Bank. I use World Bank data because you do want comparable data across countries. We look at India, China, and the world. We look at 1981 and 2005. Though this was accessed in 2018, the most recent data point was available only for 2005. But anyway, that's good enough to make our point. What is clearly striking here, India has a larger share of people in poverty, defined in this way, than the world average. And it has, in fact, a much higher figure by 2005. In 1981, it was not so bad. And in 1981, it's also quite significant that China had much higher, not just higher levels of poverty than India. And it's kind of interesting, a point that Sen has been making, and it's easy to see why he does so. This slipping back of India vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and China in particular, as far as poverty is concerned, seem to be happening precisely at a time when India begins to grow faster. Of course, it had begun to grow faster in the 1950s compared to the first half of the century. But the 1980s is the next time when it actually begins to surge ahead in some sense. But it seems to have done a worse job as far as the reduction of poverty is concerned than the rest of the world. So there's a very large number of people, as recently as 2005, live on this extremely low poverty line of $1.25 per day. Look at life expectancy at birth. I mean, China and the world, India has less than the world average. Right? Indians live shorter lives. Under 5 mortality, whether you survive at all or your life is snuffed out when you're 5. This, thankfully, is more recent data, as recent as 2016. It's under 5 mortality per live births, male and female. The Indian average for men is marginally better than the world, almost the same level as the world, but for women it's actually worse than the world. For China, in China, women have a higher chance of surviving beyond 5 than men. Not much higher chance, but certainly a higher chance, which is quite interesting. So as far as under 5 mortality is concerned, India lags very, very, very substantially behind China. And it's kind of interesting as far as the female to male mortality rates are concerned. In the comparison within China, China was not a society which was very particularly favorable to women, feet binding, and the rest of it. But by now, actually, at least on this score, the status of women seems to have improved very substantially. Prevalence of undernourishment. It's much higher in China than India. Sorry, I should have given the metric. It is calorie intake. India has higher malnourishment than the world and substantially higher malnourishment than China. Adult literacy rate, which is the proportion of the population which is literate. The Indian figures are lower than the world. And for women, very much substantially lower than that of men, and very much lower than that for China. Inequality, this is the Gini coefficient. Here, India seems to have a lower inequality than China. But I just, for those who are interested in this sort of thing, let me just mention to you, the Gini coefficient measures inequality across the entire distribution. You could measure it for parts of the distribution, for instance. What is the relationship between average incomes in the top 5% and the bottom 5%? That gives you a stark contrast. When you do that, India has much higher inequality than China. But if you take the average exactly, India does slightly better than China. This is for 2011 for India, 2012 for China. As development indicators are not entirely independent of the initiative made through public policy, it would be of interest to see if we can say something about intent in this regard in India. What effort has India made to actually build up the capabilities of its population? So one of these measures could be the government expenditure on health. And you find actually the government expenditure on health is as a percentage of total expenditure on health by the population is half of that of the world, right? And a little less than half of that of China. Expenditure on education, government expenditure on education. I've deliberately put the United States in there. United States, a country which is generally not very sympathetic to public expenditure. The figure on public expenditure in the United States is higher than the world average and much higher than the Indian. All of this is basically suggesting that no serious effort has been made in India to actually, in relation to the rest of the world, to build capabilities of the population. So it's not really very surprising that we saw that the health and education indicators that we saw at the beginning of my presentation of this data. Overall, it may be said that public policy in India in itself has been less devoted to the formation of basic capabilities of the Indian population than has been the case elsewhere across the world. We also have reason to believe that public expenditure in India may be biased towards the better off. And I just want to give you the following statistic to show that. This is government expenditure per student as a percentage of GDP per capita. Note that the relationship in government expenditure in tertiary and primary, look at the distance in India is much, much, much higher than it is in the rest of the world, right? You would expect that expenditure per student would be higher in tertiary than in schooling, right? Naturally, universities cost more. But the scale of the gap is what is just kind of extraordinary in India. In relation to the world. And it's kind of interesting, the scale is much lower. So the distance is much, much lower in the United States. Almost lower than, or it's close to the world average. I mean, that's why the United States is concerned. But much higher. India spends much more. Government expenditures is certainly skewed towards universities vis-a-vis private primary education. This is not a point sufficiently widely recognized, but I think it's very important. So the challenge of democracy in India, well, Nehru already stated it in 1947, the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease, and the inequality of opportunity. While seeing that India comes off poorly in a global comparison, and this is a point which is worth making, it is useful to recognize that the progress of development is not uniform across the country. I say this because there is sometimes a tendency to see, as did V.S. Naipaul, India is uniformly an area of darkness. There are no silhouettes even to be observed. Yeah, so I think it's useful to recognize. And it's useful, especially when you not as something to save us this ignominy, but to realize that it may have something to do with the working of democracy. And my talk is on democracy after all. To extract the nature of the differences between states, I compare some standard indicators of development across Kerala, Gujarat, and China. It's coming to an end. Kerala and Gujarat have adopted broadly different modes of development. Public policy has on balance focused on welfare in the former and on growth through private entrepreneurship in the latter. So if you look at the infant mortality between Kerala, China, Gujarat, person, male, female, just look at, just look at person, it's good enough. I mean, China is ahead of Kerala, but Kerala is not very much behind China, and Kerala is ahead of Gujarat, which is does a little worse than Kerala and China. Yeah, all right. So life expectancy at birth, Kerala, China, Gujarat, China ahead of Kerala. But as interesting as far as female life expectancy is concerned, not very much ahead of Kerala, but Gujarat is behind. The sex ratio, there's a very interesting work by the statistician Ronald Fisher, who was of the view that in a population left to itself, the sex ratio would be 1:1, right? So you should find as many women as there are men in a population. By this benchmark or criterion, interestingly, even China doesn't fare as well as an Indian state. Gujarat fares worse. Adult literacy male, we've looked at it, so I won't look at it again. National poverty lines. It's kind of interesting that Kerala does not lag very much behind China, but China is far ahead of Gujarat. I'd just like to say, before I begin to appear a living advertisement for Kerala tourism, the point of this is basically to show that diversity exists in India. And human development indicators are not everything, as you will see in a while. So this is inequality, and I don't want to. It's kind of interesting. I just want to say Kerala has high inequality if you look at the Gini coefficient, almost as high as that of China. Kerala, but it's not widely enough known that Kerala is a state with very high inequality for reasons that we can discuss, but that's not germane to what I'm talking about. Consumption by social group. It's interesting that Kerala has higher consumption than Gujarat. And this, of course, is due to remittances, where therefore some consumption is not part of not from domestic income, but but it's kind of interesting that actually even the SC group in Kerala has higher consumption, well, very close to that of the average in Gujarat. All right. So the difference, and that's the point that I want to make. The difference in development outcomes within India suggests we cannot rely on the mere presence of certain political institutions to deliver development in a society. After all, Kerala and Gujarat have the same institutions of democracy, right? They are all within India and governed by the same laws. The architecture is the same. The differential outcome appears, however, to depend on how democracy works in society, or should you say, how societies work democracy. Maybe that's how you should say it. History would matter here. The comparison we have made shows that in the pursuit of justice, we ought to avoid what Sen terms transcendental institutionalism, where you just look at architecture. X is socialist, Y is capitalist. There's a very telling remark by Nirja Gopal Jayal. The phrase is the illusion of citizenship under the socialistic pattern of society. And that is the kind of thing, a nice way to understand what Sen is trying to say. Transcendental, you just look at the institutions, which I don't think is sufficient, is what the point there. So what about women in development? None of what has been presented by me should lead to the presumption that Kerala development experience is optimal or desirable in any way. And since I have very little time, I'm just going to move on, and I just want to point to you female legislators in state assemblies. Kerala does better than Gujarat. Sorry, Gujarat does better than Kerala as a proportion, and India does better than Gujarat, which is also kind of interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. So human development indicators by themselves do not assure female or women's agency is important. And this is important because if you just look at the last column, despite the very substantial participation of women in elections in Kerala, they are denied a role in lawmaking or as lawmakers. Yeah? The women of Kerala participate in elections equally, but are denied an equal role in governance. Is an important point to make, I think. The data from Kerala imply that enhancing the capabilities of women does not necessarily imply a greater role for women in governance. This has been identified or described, is probably a better word, as a Kerala paradox. There's a very fine paper by two Indian women, Aparna Mitra and Pooja Singh, on this. Gujarat fares better than Kerala in this respect, but we can say women's presence in India and governance in governance in India is yet unacceptably low. What is Mao's interesting comment? I mean, women hold up half the sky. It takes some time before women have, in effect, at least in Indian democracy, that kind of equality, right? And I just want to finish by referring to what I call the deadly effect of patriarchy. The magnitude of the problem of gender discrimination in India may be seen if you track the sex ratio over time, and the following graphs do just that. So this is sex ratio of populations, again Kerala and Gujarat, from 1941 to 2011. It's just the number of women to a number of men. After a brief period of not doing so well, or the sex ratio declining, the sex ratio has increased very considerably in Kerala. It has on balance by 2011 in Gujarat. It is lower than what it was in 1941. And you might want to look at the All India figure. The All India figure is kind of cyclical, but by 2011 is still what it was in 1941. I mean, surely this is somewhere. Radhakrishnan has a very fine speech again delivered at midnight in August 14, right? Where he says the test of democracy is how it treats its minorities. So that certainly would be true, but it's women are not necessarily a minority in some parts of India, but that doesn't assure that they have received the treatment that they deserve. I mean, even in Kerala, where the sex ratio is greater than 1, their agency has been crimped in some way. Shockingly, the already unbalanced sex ratio in India has declined since 1941. A section of the Indian population has had to struggle to have their identity recognized under democracy. However, for women, it appears to have been a struggle for their very existence. In the discourse in India, relatively little attention is given to the hold of patriarchy on our lives, despite its incompatibility with democracy and the visibly debilitating consequences it has had for India's women, and one might say for India's own prospects, by way of a conclusion. To maintain a focus, I have confined my evaluation of democracy in terms of nationalism, secularism, and freedom. Developments that deserve as much attention are the increasing surveillance of citizens in India, the rise of corporate influence on economic policy, and the absence of internal democracy in our political parties. Going by its procedural aspects, India's democracy may appear to be alive and kicking. I just mean we have 3 elections in 3 major states due very soon in the next month, but we should be wary of the turn that it has taken, especially of late in India. Democracy is only as good as its record in securing a national unity, giving voice to minorities of every kind, and contributing to advancing the freedom of individuals in ways that they choose. Democracy in India is challenged on all 3 grounds today, but it's the first 2 that receive disproportionate attention, going by what may be observed in the media, i.e. nationalism and secularism. To be precise, the discourse on democracy is currently being set disproportionately by political parties emphasizing one or the other of nationalism and secularism, crowding out attention to freedom, which in its substantive sense is the whole point of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.